let's talk about some of these reforms that go into place during this era. Okay, and keep in mind that that these are all brought about by election, by voting, right? Okay, so first one, direct democracy, where rather than having everything done by the governor and the legislature or by the president and the Congress, especially in the states, we see the implementation of these three reforms: proposition, the referendum, and the recall. And we should be familiar with all of those here in California, because everybody knows that whenever there's an election, there's signs all over the place saying yes on 13 and no on 7 and that sort of thing, right? And what are we voting on? We're voting on things that we think should be enacted into law. And if there's a majority that's in favor of a certain proposition, then it gets enacted into law, right? So that's us ruling ourselves. That's direct democracy. Okay, you follow what I'm saying? So that's the proposition. The referendum is when the legislature does something that we think is wrong. We can actually vote to have that law repealed, right? So let's say that we have a proposition IC, and that proposition says everybody gets ice cream on Tuesdays, right? And we like that idea. So we go ahead and vote for everybody getting ice cream on Tuesdays, right? And it goes into law, but the legislature doesn't like that, right? Because they're, invested in the chocolate industry. So they don't want people eating ice cream. They want them eating candy. So they pass a law saying nobody gets ice cream, right? So in one sense, we enacted a law that we wanted, and then we see the legislature acting against our interests, so we can overthrow that law. We could do away with that law, right? By voting, if the majority of the people say that law shouldn't go into an effect, then it doesn't, right? You get what I'm saying? Okay, so that's the referendum, and then the recall is when you don't like what the politician's doing, you can vote them out of office. All right. So all of those things together, you can see that happening right now with Newsom. A lot of people are trying to recall Newsom, right? And then there was Gray Davis actually was recalled, right? And that's when the governor became governor, right? Okay, so all three of these together then are the implementation of what we would call direct democracy. But let me just give you a caveat to all this, and that is, in order to get a proposition on the ballot, you have to get so many signatures, and in order to get those signatures, you're going to have to pay people to go stand in front of the grocery store and collect them, right? You guys have all seen them out there, right? And same with the referendum and the recall. Somebody has to go and collect those signatures, and that's going to cost money, right? And so what we see happening then is that the special interests write the proposition, and they hire the people to collect the signatures so that they can get their proposition on the ballot, right? But because they have the money, they're still able to essentially bypass this idea of direct democracy in a way. So what we see is that that the special interests still have influence on government. It's just they get their influence in a different way. Instead of just paying money to the legislature, they pay it to people who collect signatures, right? But they still get their way. You guys get what I'm saying? And there is more democracy built into it than before, but there is still that danger of, or the actual reality of special interests kind of hijacking that whole thing. All right. Questions, comments about any of that?
Do all propositions require signatures, or can it just be big money?
No, they have to be. You have to have a certain number of the registered voters who sign in favor of the proposition in order to be able to get it on the ballot. I think it's like 5% or 10%, something like that, right? And then once it's on the ballot, then generally the people would vote for it in the next election, unless, like, for example, there was a proposition, I think it was the proposition to divide California into 3 different states, right? And that actually was, they did collect signatures for that, but then it was rejected by the courts, so it never went on the ballot. Any other questions, comments? Okay, all right. So that's direct democracy. Also, direct election of U.S. senators. You guys will remember that we talked on Monday about how the Senate had become a millionaires club because they were appointed by the states, and the states, so the people that were the senators could actually buy their way into office, and then they would work for whoever gave them the money rather than the people that elected them. And so that will be actually enacted in 1913, where 17th Amendment to the Constitution says that all senators are elected, and that's what we see happening everywhere today, including in California. We saw that Kamala Harris was elected senator when Barbara Boxer retired, but interestingly, when she left office, then how did we choose who took her place?
The governor chose.
Exactly. And that's how it was done before the 17th Amendment. You get what I'm saying? That same thing happened, for example, in Illinois when Barack Obama was elected president. He was senator from Illinois, so he left his seat in the Senate to become president, which left that seat open. And then the governor, Blagojevich, basically sold that seat. He put it up for sale, right? And then he ended up going to jail for that, right? He was pardoned by Trump, but he went to jail for selling a Senate seat, essentially, right? You get what I'm saying? So, and that shows us then how the corruption could be easily built into the senators be appointed by the states. All right, questions, comments? Labor protections. Remember that before we talked about the workers, the proletariat, who we say is in, for example, on the movie that we watched, Los Mineros, right? And they were forced to work long hours for barely enough to live on. Also, there was no protection for any class of labor, actually, right? So we had kids as little as 5 and 6 years old working in factories and working in mines, things like that, right? So one of the kind of class of things that's going to come out of the progressive era is going to be the 40-hour work week and child labor laws and things like that. The thing that we need to understand is that, like, for example, when we looked at that movie, Los Mineros, what that movie told us was that it was the unions that actually caused these changes to come about. But the reality was that the unions didn't become powerful until after World War II. And these laws were put in place well before World War II, even before World War I, right? And so then who was it that actually did this? It wasn't the labor movement, because the labor movement was essentially dead in the United States at the time. There were unions, but they were not popular, and there weren't very many people in them, right? So these labor protections are put in place by progressives, who we already said were the middle class, right? So why would the middle class be interested in putting in protections for the workers?
The child labor laws make sense because you shouldn't be working children like that anyways.
Why?
I mean, because like I don't like morally, like I don't know, like they're children, they're developing, they have to do school.
That would be dangerous, I guess. Right?
Yeah, I was gonna say
that's their developmental growth.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right, but But what if you don't care about that? What if all you care about is making money?
Oh, it's kind of working for
Yeah.
China.
I'm sorry?
It's kind of working for China.
Well, I mean,
Right.
that's the thing. What we see happening there is what happened everywhere in the Industrial Revolution, right? So, the idea that, I mean, yeah, it's morally wrong, but what happens if you're the parents of a kid that gets killed in a mine? How are you going to respond to that? Are you going to be happy?
No, not at
No,
all.
you're not going to be happy. So
No.
what are you more likely to do? Are you going to be a good, happy worker after that? Are you going to be an upstanding member of society after that?
I'm raising hell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
About to say, I'll get my 2 weeks getting out of there.
Well, you couldn't though, because if if you got out of there, you would get nothing. There was no place to go.
Yeah, true.
Right. So, I mean, that's the thing. So what then that does is it creates social conflict, social upheaval, right? And if there's enough social upheaval, what happens? What happens to the people that are property owners?
They lose your stuff.
They lose their stuff. Exactly. So when we look at the progressive interest in labor reforms, the progressives weren't laborers, but they were interested in labor reforms, and there was a moral component to it, that many of them saw that the suffering of the people was wrong and needed to be addressed. But there was also this economic component as well, because if we don't want people who own things don't want social upheaval, they want calm, right? And you're not going to get calm by creating a class of people that hates you, right? You follow what I'm saying? So
Yes.
there was basically both of those things, but it was really put in place by progressives rather than the unions. The unions come later, and unions are really important, but at this point in time, they were pretty ineffective. Okay, questions, comments about this? Okay, so corporate regulation, antitrust, anti-monopoly, and railroad regulation is to address, well, really anti-consumer policies are put in place by companies. And so if we say, okay, we're going to regulate the companies, who's that going to hurt?
If
Let's
it's
say it this way.
Companies,
Let's say it this way. Let's say it the other way around. If we don't regulate the companies, who does that hurt?
the workers.
The workers, and not just the workers, but consumers in general, right? Because the prices are fixed, there's no competition, right? Okay, but now if we are able to regulate the corporations, who benefits?
Consumers.
Consumers. What about, I mean, if you think about it, the corporations also benefit because the workers essentially will be more happy, right? And because of that, they'll be able to, the regulation actually helps them. It doesn't help them in terms of their, immediate bottom line, but it does help them in the long term by allowing them to stay in business, right? You guys are with me? Questions, comments? So generally speaking, the corporations will never support any of this stuff, but if you look at it in a pragmatic way, you can see that it actually does help them, all right? Questions, comments? About any of this?
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Sorry, comment. That reminds me of, I don't know if the story is true or not, but Ford giving his workers Saturdays off so that way they'd go buy his cars.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was a big thing. Ford was one of the first companies to introduce things like company health insurance and, limits on the amount of work you could do and things like that. And the reason why was because he realized that if he kept his workers happy, they would work better and make better products for him, and he'd make more money, right? You see what I'm saying? And he wasn't the only one that did that. He was the first one, but then afterwards, people started to see the problem was that I think there was an era, really right around the time of the progressive era, when American corporations started to see that they had a responsibility to the common good, right? But that's kind of an anomaly. In general, corporations are not going to be interested in the common good. Corporations are going to be interested in the bottom line, right? And that's more like the way we see it today. You don't see companies acting in ways that are helpful to people. You see them acting in ways that will acquire as much wealth as possible for their shareholders. You follow what I'm saying? And so
I think there's still some good companies out there that kind of, like once you get inside them, they take care of their employees like a lot better than other companies do.
I do agree with that, but they're not the only way that they would be socially responsible would be if it was to their benefit. And if it was to their benefit to not be socially responsible, then they would do that. If they had to choose between being socially responsible and not making money and being socially responsible and making money, a lot of them would choose the former or whatever. You know what I'm saying, right? Okay, not everyone, but that's the problem. The problem is that without government regulation, they might or they might not. It's up to them. With government regulation, then they're required to act in the public interest. You follow what I'm saying here? And so anyway, that's really the argument for and against regulation. Okay. So then the next thing, social experimentation and control. Prohibition was one. Here's the idea behind prohibition, right? That drinking turned out to be a big problem among the working classes. And the reason why was because you had some guy who was a non-skilled worker who was like working down at the docks, and he would get paid either at the end of the day or at the end of the week, whatever, right? And he would get paid in cash, and he would take that money, and on the way home he'd stop off at the bar and he'd start drinking, and he'd spend all the money. And then he'd show up at home sometime around midnight drunk, and the wife would be waiting for him there with the roller to start beating on him, and then there would be, he'd beat her up, right? And then the next thing you know, there's all this domestic turmoil, and then on top of that, because he's not bringing home the money, they get thrown out into the streets, right? And that creates even more social turmoil, right? So how do you respond to that? Well, the way the progressives decided to respond to it was, well, let's just make drinking illegal, right? If you make it illegal, nobody will drink. Does that make sense?
Yeah, on paper, yes, but people are gonna try and sneak it in no matter what.
Right, and that's exactly what happened. So, I'm sorry?
That's why they made moonshine, and they started having what was it? I can't remember what they're called, but they had like these little hidden secret bars and clubs that like
Speakeasies.
Yeah,
like where it's only word of mouth.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the thing: is that the strategy was, we're going to get rid of drinking so that we can make people happier and healthier, right? But in reality, what ended up happening was that they fed into, what they did was they made all the drinkers criminals, and then they created this criminal organization that supplied alcohol to people, which ends up being organized crime, right? So organized crime really is created in a way by this misguided attempt to make society better. You follow what I'm saying? All right, so that's kind of that was a kind of a backfire. Same thing with anti-prostitution laws. Now, there isn't any federal law against prostitution, but there are, almost every state has laws against it, except I'm pretty sure Nevada, right? Okay, so the idea about prostitution was that these young women would have to sell themselves into prostitution in order to be able to support themselves, and it was demeaning to their womanhood, and it was also demeaning to their humanity, and it was harmful to them, right? And so we're going to make it illegal. And if we make it illegal, that means nobody will do it anymore, right?
No.
No.
No, because they were doing it to survive. So they really didn't have a choice, legal or not.
It's the same. It's the same. In fact, it makes the problem worse because before these anti-prostitution laws, prostitutes lived in houses. There were houses of prostitution. Now they can't do that, so they're standing out on the streets. You follow what I'm saying? So they're in more danger now than they were before. I'm not saying that we should support prostitutes. I'm just saying that this effort to regulate prostitution turns out to be to have unintended negative consequences. You guys get what I'm saying? Questions, comments? Okay, and then finally, expansion of the franchise. Now, this is partly it was part of the progressive platform for women's suffrage, not suffering, but suffrage, right? But it was also encouraged by America's entry into World War One, and the reason why was because the United States entered the war, and a lot of men were sent to war, and those men who went to war were patriots, but they weren't able to vote because they were overseas. And in those days, there wasn't absentee ballots and mail-in ballots and that sort of thing, right? So what that meant was that the only people who could actually vote were the men who didn't go to war, and they were a bunch of cowards and wussies, right? You follow what I'm saying? But women, there were patriotic women who couldn't vote, but if we gave them the vote, then they would vote. They would vote in. They would be a counterbalance, I guess you could say, to the cowards and wussies, right? And so that was one of the things that caused the 19th Amendment actually to be enacted, because the way an amendment is enacted is it's passed by the Congress, and then it has to go to the states, and 2/3 of the states have to ratify it in order for it to become a law. And that was not likely to happen until World War One happened, and this situation of the voting men being gone, voting population being gone. There are actually some states that have still not ratified the 19th Amendment, mostly states in the South. but because
like Alabama.
Yeah, exactly. But because it's a federal law, they have to allow women's voting anyway. You guys get what I'm saying? Questions, comments? Let's think about this now. Who does allowing women to vote, who does that help?
Women and the populace in general.
Literally everyone.
Exactly. Everyone. Everyone benefits from more people being able to vote, right? You guys get what I'm saying? Okay. All right. We'll just leave it at that. Okay. I to be honest with you, ontologically, I cannot imagine how people could support the idea of excluding women from society. But that's because of my ontological outlook today, not because of historically, I probably would have thought differently if I lived at the time.